This is the Žižek Dictionary entry for Derrida by Andrea Hurst. Žižek's encounters with Derrida belong to a tradition of mutual Lacanian Derridian agnostics, in which Derrida's thinking was initially dismissed as mere textualism. From the reminder that phenomena take recognizable shape only through interpretive artifice, and that an irreducible gap remains between event and its linguistic description, it was too quickly concluded that Derrida eradicates any referent, and, in an auto-created world of self-referential textuality, celebrates a free play of differences without purchase on reality, and too playfully ironic to be practically relevant. Sensitive to Derrida's objections, Žižek belongs to another generation of critics, retaining the assumption that Derrida sharply divides text from referent, or equally phenomenal from absolute other. Žižek's charge is the reverse of textual narcissism. Supposedly, in a Levinasian about-turn, the later Derrida negates the textual imagination, for example, legal systems, political measures, to preserve a pure, transcendent referent, a hypostasized absolute other such as justice itself. Derrida's operation, Žižek argues, merely turns from textualism to a different, but equally practically impotent impossibility. He argues that Lacanian logic, represented inter alia through Lacan's Borromean knot, copes better with the complexities of ethical practice. The Lacan-Derrida encounter is consistently based on mutual misconstrual, and Žižek's reading is no exception. However, unpacking his misinterpretation of Derrida's operation has the value of clarifying Lacan's ontological stance concerning the traumatic real and the complex logic of human appropriation, which, incidentally, finds allegiance, not opposition, in Derrida's operation, properly understood in terms of the plural logic of the aporia. Using Creon and Antigone as metonyms for two extreme attitudes, unprincipled pragmatism and totalitarianism, Žižek takes up Derrida's insistence that one ignores at one's peril the irreducible gap between economic, phenomenal reality, the human law Creon invokes, and the aneconomic, transcendent, divine other, obeyed by Antigone. To close the gap, by denying all transcendent otherness in the name of phenomenal reality, can only be to promote the unprincipled pragmatism exemplified by Creon, whose refusal to contravene the letter of human law makes him a pragmatic state politician, mercilessly crushing any activity that would destabilize the smooth functioning of the state and civil peace. However, to leave open the gap by submitting phenomenal reality to a hypostasized divinity is instead to risk totalitarianism. Antigone remains blindly faithful to the singular call of the divine, which nobody else can understand. As a proto-totalitarian, her decision to bury her brother is the result not of careful deliberation, but of her insistence on her divine, sovereign right to do just what she decides, whatever it is. Between unprincipled pragmatism and totalitarianism, one faces what Lacan calls the mugger's choice, i.e., the injunction to choose your money or your life. This is no choice at all. A circularity persists whereby, in choosing one option, the other is lost. Yet, because they are interdependent, this is also to lose the original choice. Negatively, in rejecting one option and gaining the other, one thereby regains the rejected original. Fearing the terror of singular totalitarianism which threatens the social edifice, one might institute a shared regulatory legal economy that aims instead for justice. However, The consequence of perfecting this economy by eradicating evils, unfairness, singularities, etc., is not the hoped-for justice, but rigid prescriptions that apply badly from above to dynamic ethical realities. Ironically, when laws prevail over justice, law becomes totalitarian. Conversely, fearing the merciless strictures of unbending law, one might, like Antigone, answer to an anarchic, singular idea of justice itself. But all individuals, then, may legitimately apply personally held supreme principles at their own discretion. The consequence of this successful totalitarianism, where no overall principle suffices to arbitrate between power struggles, must be unprincipled pragmatism. This lose-lose circularity suggests that viable ethical practice cannot depend on either or choices between binary opposites. On the impotence of binary thinking, Žižek and Derridians concur. Žižek claims, however, that Derrida cannot offer an adequate heuristic to negotiate the mugger's choice between immanence, Creon, and transcendence, Antigone, because his thinking remains trapped within a religious matrix that understands the real in terms of sharply opposing ontological spheres. Derrida, for example, retains the irreducible opposition between the messianic call for justice and its ontologization, its transposition into a set of positive legal and political measures. Further, all determinate economico-political measures will betray the transcendent principle of, for example, justice, because Derrida has merely replaced a problematic positive figure of the absolute other, associated with the metaphysics of presence, with its equally problematic conception as a hypostasized absolute absence. This means that our relationship with the other cannot be one of active hermeneutic uncovering. Instead, we must respect the purity of the absolute other by renouncing any determinate structure involving real people in real circumstances and embracing a primordial passivity, sentiency, of responding, of being infinitely indebted to and responsible for the call of an otherness that never acquires positive features. This move, Žižek argues, underpins the unacceptable lesson of deconstruction. Facing the impossible, we may justly renounce any demand for determinate decisions concerning practical measures. By contrast, Žižek adopts Lacan's supposedly alternative understanding of the real as one ontological region whose immanent transcendence presents as trauma. Lacan argues that the other can neither be hypostasized nor negated, and thus, as Kopyak notes, eternally returns or repeats. The hard kernel of the real that halts analytical interpretation because we cannot make complete sense of it is also a seed, as disseminative as difference, because we are obliged, nevertheless, to strive for sense. This describes the dynamic of immanent sublimation. It is in its determinate interpretations that an event is constituted as a phenomenon, but precisely because they cannot be definitive, these interpretations themselves require interpretation. Thus, the determination of an event endlessly calls for more determination, and the event becomes self-transcending. To explain why Žižek's encounter with Derrida is misconceived, one must address Derrida's adjudication between phenomenology and Levinasian ethics in Violence and Metaphysics. Ironically, Žižek's critique of Derrida's operation precisely echoes Derrida's critique of Levinas for a. opposing a centripetal Greek spirit of totality, sameness, immanence, history, philosophy, to a centrifugal, eschatological, implicitly Hebraic spirit of infinity, otherness, transcendence, ethics. B. insisting on an abyssal gap between these poles. C. Assuming an either-or choice between supposed opposites. And D. Rejecting what he sees as violent, phenomenological totalization for the pure nonviolence of an appeal to infinity, which he calls ethics. Derrida shows in multiple ways that Levinas's insistence on the purity of the wholly other remains inconsistent, since his discourse in fact requires the contaminating phenomenology he rejects. Derrida argues accordingly that we have no access to any pure spirit of nonviolence, but can only choose the passage of least possible violence between the paralyzing extremes of totality and infinity. This passage, he argues, is achieved better by Husserl than Levinas. For Levinas, the alterity of the wholly other is respected only by abandoning hermeneutic uncovering. Phenomenology, by contrast, can tolerate the inescapable violence of active appropriation by accepting that inadequation, the impossibility of perfect evidence, marks transcendence. This imperfection accommodates both an indefinite potential in the other for phenomenality, for showing, illumination, and evidence, and respects its alterity, its wonder, terror, surprises, and secrets. Derrida does appreciate Levinas's power to highlight the structural violation of otherness built into traditional philosophy, including phenomenology. Against strict Husserlian phenomenology, he launches an adapted wholly other, which points not to an external other in opposition to the sphere of immanence, but to the unpredictably inscribed within every imminent horizon of expectation, which opens all phenomena to potentially traumatic shattering. This precisely aligns his discourse with the paradox of immanent transcendence described in Lacan's version of the traumatic real. To deal with this ontology of immanent transcendence in order to show, for example, that genuinely ethical action is neither purely phenomenal, obedience to moral codes, nor a passive, abject response to the call of an inscrutable other, both Lacan and Derrida develop complex logics of contamination. As Žižek explains, to understand the logical structure underpinning Antigone's act as an act of decision rather than proto-totalitarianism, one must develop a spectral analysis of the other as a threefold concept. The imaginary other names other people like me, my neighbor, as my mirror image. The symbolic big other refers to the impersonal codes that coordinate intersubjective coexistence, and the impossible thing indicates an unfathomable, monstrous otherness in every person. Notably, this is aligned with Derrida's contention that terms like the other cannot cohere, since they encompass incompatible senses, which can neither be reduced to one another nor ordered hierarchically. Instead, these senses are bound together in complex forms, like the Borromean knot of circular opposition and interdependence. Here the linkage between them is such that each holds the other two together and apart in a tensioned relationship, and suspending one term engenders the collapse of the other two. To understand Antigone's act, Žižek explains, one must first note that the monstrous thing only becomes a fellow human like me through a third mediating agency, the impersonal symbolic order to which all of us are willing to submit. To suspend the functioning of the symbolic order, as Antigone did, is to collapse the border between knowable, friendly neighbor and unfathomable, monstrous thing. Žižek argues that the ethical act, the moment of genuine decision, is made possible only when the symbolic order is suspended and the actual Antigone becomes the thing. In this brief, passing moment of collapse, she herself becomes singular, unfathomable, inimitable. Thus, she excludes herself from the networks that constitute communal life, becoming the traumatic cause of her own framework of value. But the moment of decision is fleeting. Caputo articulates precisely this insight in Derridian terms, where he argues that justice slips our grasp. To pin justice to an event by drawing maxims from a decision, or to individuals by calling them just, is to lose what justice is. For in the former case, justice is reduced to the application of rules, whereas in the latter, justice is reduced to a knowable character trait in the friendly neighbor. Justice appears only in a singular action, in a singular situation, and this for the while that it lasts, in the instant of decision. This is just as well, for were this not the case, no intersubjective life would be possible at all. To re-establish intersubjective life subsequent to the decisive moment, the world's antagonies and their communities must come to terms with, make sense of, codify, the traumatic reconfiguration of value, and therefore face again Creon's kind of unprincipled pragmatism that the decision disrupted. Derrida argues that without this circular predicament, there would be no call for decisions, but only calculative application of laws under the illusion that we know enough, or the abdication of responsibility under the illusion that we know nothing. But it is because individuals can neither know for sure nor claim absolute ignorance that we are subject to the singularizing trauma of making decisions and taking responsibility for them. The lesson of deconstruction sounds rather a lot like the lesson of psychoanalysis.